Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series. This is not a series on postmodernism, and combining that with our series Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy to give you a sense of a couple of the terms and terminology found in the world of postmodernism. In this video, we're going to be looking at what is a simulacrum, or simulacrum if you're British. So, in common parlance, a simulacrum is simply another word for a simulation, an imitation, or a representation of something. A photograph, a video, or a description could all count as a simulacrum. However, often simulacra are considered bad imitations that attempt to create a better reality and therefore fail to accurately represent reality. So a simulacrum might be a representation that tries to create something that's better than real life, that's more desirable, more real, and therefore fail to accurately represent all of the nuance or all of the bad that happens in real life. Plato was famously opposed to mimicry and poetry, as the real world was simply an inaccurate mimicry of the forms, and imitations of the real world, therefore, were even further divorced from the forms and strayed further from truth. Nietzsche also warned against language and reason distorting reality. However, the philosopher who's most commonly associated with simulacra is Jean Baudrillard, if I can pronounce things correctly. So for Baudrillard, simulacra are imitations that fail to make reference to the original. So like we were saying, a simulacrum is something that is a representation that's not actually connected to the original thing it's representing. It has gotten so far in its level of representation that it is no longer connected to reality. You might imagine many languages starting out as a direct pictorial representation of that which they represent, just simply a series of drawings of the things that are out in the world, or perhaps verbal imitations of the sounds those things make, and slowly becoming less and less like the things they represent, to the point where those letters on a page no longer in any way look like the things that they are trying to represent, or the sounds that you're making no longer in any way sound like the things that they originally were attempting to represent. Once you get to that stage, you have a simulacrum that has become completely divorced from the original reality. This final stage of a simulacrum is something that Baudrillard has called hyperreality, a representation which is completely divorced and isolated from the original. Often, for Baudrillard at least, as a result of the technological mediation of experience. Instead of representing something in the world, a hyperreal simulacrum only represents a web of other simulacra. It represents a web of other representations. It's a representation of a representation in some ways. So when your experiences are mediated by technology and representations, they can become disconnected from reality. And that's the concern of simulacra that Baudrillard is putting forward here. The simulacra no longer represent real things. Rather, they represent other representations. They represent what we wish those things were, what we want those things to be, but not what those things actually are. These representations are disconnected from reality. One example of hyperreality might be a username in a chat room. Your name or a description of you is a simulacrum for you, but your username is what you want to be. It does not represent what you are. It's not grounded in reality. Your username is a representation of a representation. It is hyperreal because it is not a representation of you actually as a human. It is a representation of what you want to be seen as. It's a representation of a representation. Baudrillard uses the example of graffiti taggers who use a representation to hide their identity instead of a representation to describe their identity or to actually identify them. You might also think of hyperreality in political narratives. A politician with hundreds of millions of dollars pretends to be a quote-unquote normal person who doesn't really exist. There's no actual normal person that is making a living wage and is a blue-collar person that's just getting by. Their image is a representation of an idea of what a politician should be, but it doesn't actually correspond to any real politician. It's disconnected from reality. It's just connected to the public's idea of what a politician should be. The vision of a political party that harkens back to restoring a time in the past when, quote unquote, everything was better, whether that's due to stricter gender roles or having a global empire, what have you, is creating a representation of something that never was, built on the Pollyanna principle that we remember the good and forget the bad. And so this representation of we're going to restore a time when this country was better than it is right now is often considered hyper-real because it's a representation of something that never actually was. Because while things may have been better in some sectors in the past, they also were worse in others. Such a representation is hyper-real because it has become disconnected from the reality that it's purporting to represent. Rather, it's representing what we wish that reality was. It's a representation, their messaging is a representation of a representation, that idealized past or that idealized political candidate, which is disconnected from the reality of the past or the reality of that political candidate. Baudrillard claimed that, quote, I have nothing to do with postmodernism. However, there are clear connections to many of the themes of this amorphous movement with Simulacrum. Art representing other art instead of reality is essential to postmodernism and is also an example of the hyperreal. The mediation of artistic experience with technology is both a component of the mixed mediums of postmodern art as well as our increasingly hyperreal simulacra that are further mediated by technology, further separating us from reality. The inability to gain direct meaning or objective interpretations of events absent a paradigm or a meta-narrative is deeply and centrally postmodern, and at least in part a result of the mediation of experience by simulacra and representations. So, despite Baudrillard's protests, simulacra are deeply connected to postmodernism conceptually. What do you think? Is the mediation of experience by simulacra leading us to a world where of the hyperreal, where everything we consume is merely a representation of a representation of what we want the world to be, not a representation of what the world actually is? When you're scrolling through someone's vacation pictures on Instagram, are you seeing something that's actually real, or are you seeing something that has been filtered through the lens of technology and is what that person wishes their vacation was and in no way connected to what their vacation actually is? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and hit subscribe, hit the notification bell if you liked this video and you wanted to see more. We are doing a whole big 14-part series on postmodernism and on all of these complex topics. So if you want to see those videos, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss them. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org and stay skeptical, everybody.